All right. Well, hello, everyone. Today's a bit of an experiment. I'm experimenting with covering, leading the meeting occasionally for Ava and Ed as travel season heats up, holiday season heats up, etc. So thank you for bearing with me as I worked out a few Zoom things on my back end, and it is great to be here. All right. Well, it looks like people have been filling in the attendee list in the doc, which I'm now sharing. So that is fantastic. And I think we've already, let's see here. Do we have anyone new to this meeting on the meeting? It's hard to see all the participants when I'm sharing. There we go.
I do see a couple of folks that might have only joined once before. We've often had folks who are like, if you've been here less than 3 times and you want to reintroduce yourself, say hello again, you're welcome to.
Let's go ahead and do that. If you've been here less than 3 times, would like to introduce yourselves again, please feel free to. We would love to get to know you.
Wayne Beaton. I'm here with my colleague Sean Kilpatrick.
Hello.
With the Eclipse Foundation. Really just still trying to get our bearings here, so don't expect too much useful stuff out of us today.
Awesome. And we absolutely have to talk Broadway sometime, Sean. But not in this meeting, not in this meeting.
All right, we'll table that.
This is why we have a Slack. We have Slack.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
All right. Anybody else? All right. Well, hearing none, let's go ahead and start with the first item, which is the reminder to reach out to language and build tool communities. Are there any updates on this?
I see my name down there on the JavaScript side, and that's a good reminder. I need to follow up with those folks.
Okay, cool.
Question, Ava, are you reaching out to the JavaScript language side or the Node side or both?
I was going to reach out to the Node side. There are several Node maintainers at GitHub that I know.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. And it looks like they're having yet another entertaining week this week from some of what I'm seeing on Twitter.
Yeah. I've had a couple of conversations with them internally, and they've just been utterly swamped with emerging crises.
Oh,
So I've also been interacting with somebody who's on the Node talk or TAC or TSC, I lose track of which one they're using there. Would you mind if we also added me there, because it will also remind me to reach out to them again?
Can do. Are you okay with adding yourself? Oh, no, I'll just go ahead and add it. It's only 3
I'm fine either way. I'm fine either way.
All right. Rust-wise, I've been having some informal conversations around this. There is interest in a project like this, so I will be continuing those. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next item in the agenda, which is we have some completed done and merge pull requests. So replacing gitref with GitOID has been successfully merged.
Yeah, that's one that we've been talking about forever. It was pointed out fairly early that the use of gitref was confusing. We should use GitOID because that was closer to common use. And so I just took the time to go, as previously agreed, and corrected all of that throughout the website. And then we talked about this, I think, last time, and sort of said, okay, modulo, the typo's getting fixed. This looks like it's probably in good shape. So we've hopefully got that fixed now.
Sounds great. Good to think of. And GitOID does make me think a little bit of a StarCraft alien or something, but I like that a lot.
Oh, there's a mascot coming. There's a mascot coming.
There has to be a mascot coming. Yes. Source provenance craft or build craft. Anyway, all right. So the GitOID, speaking of GitOIDs, the GitOID URI proposal. I'm trying not to say GitOID with a Jersey accent, but it's hard. It looks like that has been approved and merged. So we are moving forward.
Yeah, this is something we discussed in the previous spec meeting, and there were some typos that needed to be fixed, but the general consensus was that this was a good direction for things. And this was because we've had several people request from us, hey, how do we actually represent this as a URI in our SBOMs or in other places? And it seemed like our best bet then was to actually document this. And I do actually have one other question for the group. Anyone have any concerns about me just taking this up to IANA then? Who's the place you normally register these things? Cool. And for folks who want to go back, and review, the format of this is literally IANA's format. So this wasn't well, it's a great format for what they're doing here. It's not an attempt to use this as a generic, this is how we're going to specify things.
I think I heard someone start to ask a question. Was there a question out there?
Possibly just me saying, yes, go for it.
Oh, cool. Sounds fantastic. All right. Moving on, we do need to discuss and perhaps make a decision on replacing tree with DAG, which distributed acrylic graph is that?
Nailed it. That's it.
Okay, awesome, good.
So we talked about this, I think, as distributed DAG, distributed acyclic graph.
Oh, not acrylic. Oh my gosh. Okay, go ahead.
And so in sort of attempts to explain this to people, I experimented a bit with artifact dependency graph. And so having done that, basically I put together just a quick PR that replaced artifact tree with artifact dependency graph. And I wanted to make sure that we had sort of proper discussion here. Particularly, I know, Jeremy, you had very passionate views on DAGs. And so I wanted to make sure that that was correctly or appropriately captured here in your mind.
I haven't read through it. Like, I mean, I think graph is definitely the key word that we want to have here rather than tree. Just and you know, whether or not we use the term directed acyclic graph, we should just make sure that this dependency graph is specified as being acyclic, because I don't see how you could have it otherwise. It's just like just to make it clear.
Yeah, and quite honestly, I wasn't really looking for a decision on this today. It was more of a, hey, here's a thing for people to go look at to make sure that the relevant things have been captured here. You know, either by this change or that it's, you know, if you feel it's more appropriate to capture them in some other place or in some separate change, I'm fine either way. I tried to keep this one a very minimal copy paste. But yeah, I just mostly wanted to get attention to it and sort of move forward with it. I think, yeah, so that was sort of the big thing in my mind.
Yeah, the thing I'm principally concerned about is that tree is actively misleading. So long as the word tree is not being used and something a bit more precise, like, you know, graph or acyclic graph or dependency graph or something like that is fine with me.
Sounds like we might have a decent agreement there. Are there any other thoughts on this?
So I look forward to comments from folks, and then maybe we can close on it next time around if folks have had a chance to comment.
Sounds good to me. All right, moving on to the next item on the agenda, spec scope proposal. And looks like the main question, is this good to go? It's hard for me to access chat when I'm sharing my screen. If someone could share the links in chat as well, I think that would be helpful. Links to the pull requests.
Let me do that real quickly. And yes, everything is harder when you're sharing. I completely agree. So this was an attempt to get together an initial scope for the spec. And I think this sort of rolls back to the same thing, only the simpler version thereof, in that we had, if you look at the conversations, there had been some stuff that you had raised, Jeremy, about tree versus graph. And I had pushed a PR that I think they'd switched to artifact dependency graphs. So if that works for you here, and then I don't think we have Jeff here today, where Jeff's suggestion was primarily linking from the spec to some of the stuff we had on the website where we were talking about how we defined artifact identifiers and that kind of stuff.
Ed, I see your comment from about 2 weeks ago. Yeah, I would agree with that. The spec and the scope documents shouldn't call out to a dynamic resource like a website. If anything, it could refer to a other existing standards if we're building on them.
This is what normative references are for, yes.
Yep. Self-referential and references are not normative references though, so I wouldn't use this one.
Yeah, if I recall, in one of the previous meetings, we discussed the fact that we do need to somehow define some of these terms. And so I think that was just a quick stab at, hey, we need to link to something, let's not forget to do that. I'm not stuck on which method.
Okay. Is there a normative reference for the word artifact?
Not that I'm aware of. We do define it in the spec itself. But I'm not aware of a normative reference that's useful for us in this regard.
Then I suppose the question is, do any more edits need to be made to this, or does any more discussion need to be had, or is this good to go?
The very last line still says directed acyclic graph instead of ADG. Should that be updated, Ed, or was that intentionally distinct?
So that was probably an artifact of the fact that I was looking to replace trees and not DAGs. I don't think it's problematic in this situation.
It has introduced a new term in the scope doc on the very last line.
Do other folks have opinions or thoughts?
Well, I mean, directed acyclic graph is a more general term, so it does imply that you're talking about something that's more general than whatever an artifact dependency graph is.
Yeah,
it's a bit vague if that's the case.
I think the purpose of that line is to say that the scope includes guidance for build tools, such as descriptions of use cases. And so the inclusion of the phrase directed acyclic graph in that sentence broadens the scope in an unusual way, rather than helping to clarify what type of use cases it is.
So I'm perfectly happy in the background while we proceed with the meeting to go ahead and update this PR to change that to descriptions of use cases for which artifact dependency graphs and other related data structures may be used, if that works for folks.
Perfect. I'll propose the change right now.
I commented on line 7 where it says formats for specifying graph relationships between artifacts, and relationships is a bit vague here. Like,
oh, I'm sorry, did I miss that one?
Well, what do you mean by relationship?
Oh, no, my outburst of Jeremy was that I apologize if I missed one there. Oh, it's from a minute ago. Okay. I thought I missed a previous comment.
No. I just added it. So
I had to refresh for it to show up.
No, and we also have some typo stuff from Wayne, which is much appreciated, Wayne. Sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
I mean, relationships is a very general word here, and like given that you then start talking about build tools and so on, like it's probably worth being a bit more precise about like what we're actually talking about here. Like, is a relationship a producer consumer relationship between artifacts, or like mediated by a build tool? Is that what it means?
I could absolutely get behind more precision here. Do you want to drop a suggestion into the comment?
Well, I was just wanting to clarify, like, what did you actually have in mind in using that word? Is it exactly that, or do you have something else?
So the truth is that my thinking at the time, and please note, when I describe my thinking, no actual correctness should be ascribed to any statement that begins with "my thinking at the time was." So don't take it that way. But my thinking at the time was just to make sure that whatever relationships were germane to what we were doing at GitBOM were discussed. The thought itself was fuzzy in my brain. So I was not thinking in a more specific sense at the time I wrote that text. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't tighten it up and be more specific. I'm actually, quite in favor of that. Does that make sense?
Sure.
And what you were saying earlier, which has already gone out the other ear for me, it sounds right in line with a useful specificity.
Okay, I'll update my comment to include that suggestion.
Many thanks. Yeah, I have an unfortunate case of physicist brain, which is both capable of hyper specificity, but also will be very fuzzy at times.
So
Are you oh, sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
I just made a suggestion there on that specific comment. Maybe we're really talking about the parent-child relationships between artifacts.
Ooh, that's also a good thought.
Except that parent-child sort of implies tree in my mind.
So that's where I was actually going to bring the conversation. When we talk about scope, I feel like we shouldn't be limiting to just graph, because we may be excluding folks who might not immediately think of this as a graph, but first come at this as a tree. And it feels like maybe in the scope, we should be saying tree and graph. And then in the spec, where we get real precise, we should say, please note, we're really talking about graphs, and tree is a much smaller view of the larger problem.
It's more that the terminology parent-child doesn't really resonate very well for me, even if you're talking about trees. It just seems awkward.
Parent-child refers to a specific type of relationship and a specific type of graph.
Right.
It's also what we see in the diagrams. We explain this concept to other folks. So I agree with the need for precision in the spec. I don't want us to make this something that is too foreign for folks who are thinking about this with a different mental model to see how it relates to the way they view the world.
So the purpose of the scope.md document in the spec repo is to define the scope of work for our collaboration on creating the spec under that particular license, and all the collaboration and IP that goes into doing that, not corral or limit what we might do on a website or on any other documentation around this over time. If we want to call it a tree and disambiguate that somewhere else on a website, absolutely fine. This scope is scoped to the spec repo.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So we have a lot of really healthy feedback here. Let me go ahead and see what I can actually do about updating this. We may have to come back and do the final close on this next time. But I feel like we've got substantially really, really good feedback here to go ahead and incorporate in here. And I think we're very close to having the scope completed. But I don't want to, I want to make sure we incorporate the feedback we got here.
Understood. So it sounds like course of action is to incorporate the feedback and bring it back to the attention of the group in Slack or in the next meeting. All right. Moving forward, rule of two. handle SHA-1/SHA-256 GitOIDs using, we've got a few possibilities here. All right, that's the parallel tree proposal. And then we have the single dual tree. All right. And then support for non-Git identifiers. So shall we start with the walking through the dual parallel trees proposal a little bit? Let's keep that maybe time box to 5 minutes. And then move on to single dual tree and then support for non-Git identifiers.
So I'm happy to move through the dual parallel trees with a very tight time boxing. I do want to point out that on the single dual tree, that was a proposal that was made by Dave Pollock.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Who is not
able to be here today, but will be able to be in the future.
Sounds good.
And so I'm more than happy to go through the dual parallel trees and sort of get some discussion around that. And I'm happy to touch on the single dual tree, but I don't feel good about us making a call between them without having Dave part of the conversation. The other one is, Jeremy, I pulled forward your support for non-Git identifiers here because I literally don't remember all the ins and outs of it. And I wanted to make sure it didn't get dropped.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's do a brief discussion of the dual parallel trees, and then let's move on to support for non-Git identifiers with the understanding we're not going to make a decision in this meeting explicitly, but we can further everyone's understanding of at least a few of these options. So Ed, can you talk us through dual parallel trees a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. If you could just bring it up really quickly, and I'll sort of talk through it. Because the other thing is, I think the last one went very productively because people were able to comment on it as we go. And I'll go stick into the chat the link to the issue.
Perfect.
This is sort of more as an issue because it's a little bit, it's not as quick a change to things. And this was put up before we had the spec document in. But the basic thing is, GitOIDs as they stand today in common usage are based on SHA-1. They involve adding a header to SHA-1 that consists of, for our purposes, blob underscore, the size is a hexadecimal ASCII and a null character, and then taking the SHA-1 of the whole thing. And independent of the extremely intricate conversation about whether or not SHA-1 is broken or will ever be broken for this purpose, certainly SHA-1 is basically optically broken, meaning that most people, when they hear about SHA-1, are like, oh, isn't that broken?
People look at me like I have horns on my head if I mention it.
That's clearly an undesirable outcome, unless you're at a Halloween party. But yeah, so basically, clearly the optics are unquestionable. And the thing is, Git repos have realized this, and they have put into Git support for having repos transition to SHA-256 based GitOIDs. But as far as I can tell, that is proceeding glacially, meaning it's just not happening with any celerity at all. And so the thought here was, so we don't necessarily want to go to SHA-256 right now because it's not in general use, and the big part of the utility is being able to find things. But at the same time, we'd like to be able to transition smoothly, and we'd like to be able to stop having people look at null as if she has horns on her head. That would also be good for everyone. I feel like we almost transitioned towards bunny ears there, but okay. And so my proposal is actually very simple, right? Which is to have the build tools create in parallel, basically the SHA-1 and the SHA-256 GitOIDs, because it's actually not that hard to do both. And in parallel, the Git documents for both cases. Again, one flavor of hash per Git document, and embed them both into the resulting artifact. So you would get like a .bomb section that would have the SHA-1, and I think I meant this to be like a .bomb 256. I think I've intended there. So basically, you're keeping two parallel trees. Each tree has precisely one kind of GitOID, either SHA-1 or SHA-256. And we simply carry the parallel trees along in parallel, was the basic idea.
Any questions or concerns with that proposal?
I mean, I basically like it to the extent that it's easily extendable. Like it's obviously generalizable to adding some other hash function and just building a parallel tree to it. Like there's, and it certainly works in a sort of closed universe where you are in control of the entire build of everything. With any of these proposals, I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with this one as far as like if someone else doesn't provide you the SHA-256 stuff, then there's no way you can build a SHA-256 tree for your stuff if you want to consume it as an input. But I don't really see how to reconcile that easily. I don't think that's a particular problem with this proposal.
Well, and one of the other thoughts on this, if I recall from the initial discussion, and this is why we refer to this as the rule of two, that and the fact that it's always fun to make Sith references in meetings, is that you could imagine a world where everyone has transitioned to SHA-256, and everyone looks at you like you have horns on your head if you mention SHA-256, because everyone's moved on to the mumble hash for whatever value mumble is. And so you could use this to transition in that process. You could start saying, okay, well, we're going to cut over to using the SHA-256 and the SHA-mumble trees in parallel. And so you actually can carry through a transition there. And as you point out, if you want to do something custom because you're in a completely closed environment, for example, I know, Jeremy, you have great affection for Blake. And that's absolutely fine. There are lots of good reasons to have great affection for Blake. Then you certainly optionally could keep parallel trees in Blake if that made you happy.
And I think also as a practical matter, what we're not seeing is a migration. So I don't know that there will necessarily be a single pair of hashes that is always going to be good. Like I think we're going to be stuck with SHA-1 forever, and we're never going to get rid of it. So it's always going to be SHA-1 and then perhaps the two other things that people are actually using.
I am also extremely dubious that Git repos will ever move off of SHA-1 GitOids. It's just, there's so much inertia, but maybe they will.
But well, I mean, because we have this interrupt problem, that we need to have a hash function that everyone is absolutely guaranteed to produce, because otherwise, if there's a non-intersection between the set of hashes that people are using, then you're completely stuck. Whereas if you say there's always at least SHA-1, like we know that SHA-1 has a whole bunch of limitations and problems, but at least we can always build the SHA-1 tree, then yeah.
Well, let's say for the sake of argument that SHA-1 is broken to the extent that I can simply replace a single source file with a SHA-1 version of that source file. You know, you can also then compute the SHA-256 of that source file and say, okay, do they match? Right? You can use it as sort of a parity check. And while there's a lot of math involved in actually demonstrating the assertion I'm about to make as a gut assertion, I suspect SHA-1 plus SHA-256 is substantially more secure than SHA-256 alone.
Let's avoid that.
There's a lot of heavy math involved in actually making that statement, but it's certainly more secure than SHA-1 alone. So
I agree. I think the other proposal DVP had made was that we basically combine the two into the one struct, and I think that could solve the one weakness that you call out here, Jeremy, but I don't know that has the value that this has with respect to the longevity of SHA-1 and the ability for people to migrate over time that we just discussed. So I do sense that this way we're already planning for that migration, which means we can migrate to others in the future as well, because we've already gone through that process, would be beneficial.
The problem with the combined one is that each of the hashes includes the other hash, which has a security benefit, but also makes it super brittle, so that you couldn't actually add a new hash into that without having to recompute the entire world. You couldn't add anything incrementally, whereas the separate graphs, you can just add a new graph with a new hash function and not have to change any of the existing ones.
And you can't make use of things like the existing, GitOIDs for leaf artifacts in a Git repo, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a general tendency towards almost pathological degrees of modularity. So I do like the modularity of the dual tree approach. Which sort of brings me back around to, because we don't have Dave Pollack to talk about the single dual tree. Jeremy, you had basically been talking about support for non-Git identifiers.
Yeah, I mean, the principal value, I think, of using GitOID for leaf structures is the assumption that people are already using Git, and therefore you can, audit those artifacts directly out of Git repos without having to recompute anything. But that only applies if you're using Git. And in my work environment, we use a thing that's effectively mercurial, and so even though it's using SHA-1 as part of one of its hash functions for representing things, it's computed differently from Git, and so is not interoperable. So we in order to use GitBOM in that environment, we would effectively have to maintain a parallel tree of GitOIDs anyway, which is not the end of the world, and we kind of do that anyway for Git compatibility in some cases. But it would be kind of nice, if we were having using this set of tooling in a native way, to be able to just use the natural hash function that we would use for everything else. But I think that's not particularly relevant to this conversation, and I mean that's basically our problem. But I think
but you're not going to be the only ones with that problem, right?
Right.
You're a special snowflake like everyone else,
right.
All of whom have their own bizarre histories.
But I guess the more general point I was going to make was the suggestion I made quite early of just choosing a canonical separate hash function for the internals of the graph anyway, and then always just maintaining mappings between OIDs or SHA-256s or whatever hash function to that internal hash function, and therefore it's effectively standardizing on something that we consider to be strong enough and is not actually what anyone else is using, but gives us the ability to have arbitrary mappings between that hash. The internal hash function could be SHA-256 or SHA-3 or whatever. It's
one thing I do want to explore though is it felt like you were saying earlier that the dual parallel tree approach sort of opens the door for you to be able to do something that looks similar to basically keeping your own third parallel tree as you go through your build process. That one that actually matches up with what you're dealing with. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, we could. I think if we were using GitBOMs in a way where we were pulling in external artifacts that had GitBOM information associated with them, then they're not going to have our hash function anyway. So I don't actually know how we would deal with that, if it even matters. But I think the sort of most hand-wavy general point is that, to what extent do we no, it's too late for this conversation. It's called GitBOM. We might as well keep it.
Okay. I just want to make sure you have space to be heard more than anything, frankly.
I think there is a generalization of GitBOM that supports Git, but not as a special case. But I think we have enough problems to solve, even within the scope of what we're talking about here, that adding that complexity is probably not worthwhile at this point.
Okay.
So it sounds like we have a decent understanding of each of the options. I agree that we should hold off on making a decision until DPP can be here. But thank you all. I definitely understand these options a little better than I did before, and it's great foundational work for the eventual decision. So moving on to the next item, which is representing build tool / build tool configuration in a tree.
So I would like to pause to point out that other people are extremely welcome to make to open issues to open issues and to also contribute PRs. This is sort of the next one in the list. I just don't want people to feel like their input is not welcome because I happen to have been very prolific. Input is extremely welcome, including opening up PRs and whatnot. And we've got one a little further down from someone else that I think is interesting as well. But this one's actually fairly straightforward. Let me go ahead and stick the link into the chat so that folks can comment on the issue. So currently, the way we've been talking about GitBOM, we're representing solely in terms of the input artifacts, right? That's like CNH files to object files to executables, where basically, you're looking at a build step sort of like this, or for a compiler or a linker, and we're sort of reasoning about things in terms of the source code or other sort of artifact inputs. But almost every time this comes up, someone, particularly around reproducible builds, but they're far from the only people, start basically making extremely valid complaints that there's other information that we aren't capturing here that is important to them, right? In particular, two pieces of information jump out on the boiling down, which is precisely what build tool was used for each build step and precisely how that build tool was configured for each build step. Now, this is sometimes expressed as we should capture the build tool command line for this. Now, just capturing the build tool command line has substantial problems because build tool command lines often contain a bunch of ephemeral information. For example, for C compilers, they might include the -I include directory, and it shouldn't make any difference if I built the thing in my home directory versus you build it in your home directory if all the source code that went in is the same. So indiscriminately capturing the build command line doesn't actually give you terribly useful information. But and there's also the case, as I mentioned here, those of us who've been around for long enough, and I hope that's very few of us because this is an unpleasant thing to encounter, have also seen vulnerabilities that are introduced by build tools as opposed to by source code. And so the basic proposal is to say, look, what if we had a basic, common, dead simple format for a build tool information document, which just says, this is the name of the build tool as output by the freaking build tool itself, meaning we know we've got one true name because it's fucking built into the build tool. The ID, meaning sort of a GitOID of the tool. And then optionally, if the tool actually itself has its own GitBOM, the GitBOM of the tool. And that becomes a very common, simple document format. And the build tool can then output that document for itself to the metadata subdirectory to some distinguished location and include its build tool information document in the tree as an input on the same dignity as any other input like a .c or a .h file. That's sort of the first half of the proposal. Do folks have immediate thoughts on that, or?
So I like the idea. My initial reaction to that is that this is just a set of data fields that are already represented in other specs that are currently evolving, namely SALSA, the reproducible build specs, and specs to capture information about any component, whether that's a build tool or a file, and its ID identifiers, that is, SBOM specs. So it feels like we're maybe reinventing the wheel here a little bit instead of leaning on other specs that are also trying to solve this problem and figuring out how to align with them.
Yeah, my feeling is that we shouldn't be bothering with this, that The important thing is to capture the output, and then you could use a GitBOM with a set of inputs and a set of outputs to verify whether or not your reproducible build did actually reproduce the build. But it doesn't seem necessary to me that GitBOM have enough information to support performing the build itself.
So I actually have had some of that conversation with some people doing reproducible build work. And being able to actually figure out which tool was used for that build, so you can know which tool to take off the shelf to reproduce it. They seem, at least the ones I've talked to, I haven't talked to all reproducible build people, seem to feel would be of value. Now, there's a little bit of intentional, treating it as metadata that may or may not be distributed, and then putting its Git object ID or its GitOID into the tree, which means it's semi-opaque, is partially on purpose, because you also do have people who don't want to be publishing too much information about their build process in a way that's transparent for a variety of reasons, both good and bad. But that was sort of the reason I actually was thinking in these terms was that. Now, to just point, I would be very interested if you could maybe pull together for next time some of how this is handled in other places. The one thing I've been thinking in terms of the build tool information document was keeping things ultra simple. Most of the other document formats I've seen are ultra complex, and trying to get complex things into build tools is hard because they don't really want to work too hard on your problem. They have other things that are much more interesting to them. And so trying to keep things very narrow and simple was sort of foremost in my mind. But that doesn't mean there aren't existing documents that can be kept that way that we could lean on. I'd be very interested in seeing that. One of the things I was very mindful of when I sort of scribbled this idea about name : ID : GitBOM : was it happens to be the case that is currently written, it is both valid JavaScript, both valid JSON and valid YAML. Exactly as written. So
I think that kind of sorry, I was just going to say, I think that kind of metadata is complicated because it is a very intrinsically complicated domain. I'm not sure that simplifying it necessarily is useful.
Yeah.
go ahead.
I was just thinking the same thing. So for example, in the SPDX working groups, we're trying to define what is a build profile and how would you represent the right parameters of that build as part of an SBOM or related to an SBOM. How would you link out between a component and the way it was built as captured in a reproducible build manifest or something like that. And so while we're trying to define these same things, in fact, we have some folks who are leading the salsa efforts, trying to participate over there. I feel like if we plug in what we're trying to solve here with those two conversations, then we can get to a more informed output that actually solves the problem for many people.
But I think they're actually trying to solve an enormously more complicated problem, because when you say the word build profile, that's a much more complicated thing than just trying to capture the pure identity of what build tool did this step.
And yet the value of GitBOM is that we don't go into the space of talking about things like names, which change over time and all of that. So if we're just saying, hey, we need to include the GitBOM of the build tool or build package, whatever it is, then I think that perhaps we're keeping it very small. But if we're starting to include this other type of metadata here, then we are really wandering into that path.
So go ahead, Mel, sorry.
Quick question for me. By other metadata, are you referring to things like the build environment and build instructions?
If the question is for me, the way that we've been talking about it is like, who is the builder? Where is the build infrastructure? How is the build, what is the build invocation? What are those inputs? Where did you pull source from? When did you do the build? What was the output artifact that you generated?
Understood.
I think there's a tension here between, like if you incorporate all of this build tool and build instruction information into the graph, then effectively you're forcing divergence where it actually makes it really difficult for people to accidentally reproduce a build. Like if you just happen to build the same thing from the same sources, then any variance in the tooling is going to cause the output to be different, even if the binary output is actually identical. And at the other extreme, you might not care about the provenance of a particular artifact at all. Like any build step that produces this set of bits is a valid build step for that set of bits. And so if you're building something which takes that set of bits as an input, you don't necessarily care about what particular command line generated it, so long as the right bits got produced. And I think that tension is inherent and like can't be reconciled. Like that's just a design decision that we have to make. It's like which end of the use case do we want to support? Like there's a gradient there, but we have to pick a point on that and then design to that point.
Ava, it seems like you have a question.
Yeah. In listening to the discussion and thinking a bunch about this, I'm going to put up a straw man. What if the GitBOM artifact dependency graph is strictly the dependency graph or the relationships between artifacts and everything about the build, including the compiler, the flags, and everything else that you mentioned, Jeff, which is very important context and provenance. I think there's a valuable distinction between who built it and what flags were used to build it. That distinction is important to reproducibility. It's important to be able to verify it. However, it's not important to describing the relationship between inputs and outputs. And we can, and you know, in talks that I give about this, often I tell people, encourage people to have metadata referencing both the nodes in this graph and the connective links in this graph. So we could have a traditional SBOM SPDX format file that describes a particular build step in this graph and says between that .o and that executable, this is the compiler that was used with these flags in this environment by this person on this system at this time. So we can represent that information using two different standards, GitBOM and SPDX, with two different documents, and that provides all the information both parties need while still keeping the ADG strictly an ADG and not changing its definition here.
So I would like to see that, because I'm not sure I parsed all of it, but from what I did gather, I think it's pretty similar to the way that I've been talking about this as well. That is to say, like, you can capture those build flags and that other metadata as part of the way that a component was built in an SBOM with that provenance information in a build info file. And then you can include the GitBOM for that build environment, that piece of software that built some other software in that SBOM to point back towards the thing that built it.
So I'll give a couple examples that help to define the straw man that I'm painting. If we put the build tools and or the configuration, let's just say the build tools, that's I think the easier one to defend, into the tree, not the configuration or any of that. Then what happens when we do have we follow David Wheeler's advice for countering trusting trust. If you haven't read this paper, the old Schneier argument that you can't trust a compiler unless you built it yourself from source. You don't know that it isn't embedding malicious code. David Wheeler's PhD thesis on this was a counter argument. If you have two independently written compilers that are both reproducible and in a given situation, they reproduce the same byte for byte output, you don't have to trust either of them so long as you trust that they are both independently developed and have not both been compromised. They would not both contain the same malicious tampering. So if I look at that scenario and we put the compiler in the ADG, we would end up with two executables that are byte for byte equivalent, have the same identity by our definition of identity here, and yet their graphs were distinct only because they were built with different compilers. Same source, same output, different compiler should be the same graph.
So can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
Because we're running very, very close to the wire in time, which is, I feel like the best way forward here would be for me to go and file at least one, possibly two proper issues here about the problems rather than the solutions. And then we can sort of start gathering proposals around whether, how to deal with them and whether we should deal with them.
Jeremy, you have your hand up?
Yeah, so I think, there's a comment that I put on Ed's issue there, which is the GitBOM formats as they're currently specified do not encode build steps at all. And so I think there's a sort of more fundamental design discussion we should have. Like one of the reasons I've been pushing back against trees is that those diagrams that are in the issue are actually really misleading, I feel. They don't reflect the structure of GitBOM as it's specified. And so I think that is reducing the clarity on this conversation.
Understood. I think the best step at this point would be taking this asynchronously to GitHub issues and perhaps in Slack. We are at 2 minutes remaining in the hour. We still have a few things on the agenda. I just want to check in. Is there anything, as I hit my microphone, is there anything that anyone would like to specifically address in the last 2 minutes we have? All right. Well, hearing none, I have a very important question for Ed, which is in terms of physics, are you a theoretician or an experimentalist? I'm guessing theoretician, but I'm not sure if I'm right or wrong.
I am so far out on the theory tip. I'm string
Gotcha.
theory. String theory is my background.
Gotcha.
Or the theory formerly known as string theory that at the time I exited the field had turned into a morass of various multidimensional brains. Plus a whole bunch of make-believe around model dualities.
Awesome. My first programming job was in the University of Washington physics department, and I always noticed that distinction quite clearly.
It's very, very distinct, yes.
Yeah, particularly when a professor wanted something. All right, and looking at the chat, we've got a few people. Ava's going to be out next week. Jeremy's going to be out for the rest of the month. I'm going to be moving next week, God help me. So I think that it accentuates the point. Let's have these good async conversations.
Yeah, I definitely think some of this is going to need to proceed async because I know next week is KubeCon, so some folks will probably be out for that as well. And then there's the nap that comes after KubeCon. And if you're not taking the nap after KubeCon, I will scold you for not taking care of yourself.
You don't want
KubeCon
plague. Yeah.
You know who you are.
Hey now.
All right. Wayne.
No, I just have to go. I have another meeting.
Gotcha.
I'm assuming that based on everything that I just heard, the multiverse is real.
It totally is.
So I'm taking that away with me. And thank you for everybody today. This is great. I'm actually really enjoying this, even though I'm really quiet. I'll try to be more participate more as we move forward.
As it makes more sense, Wayne, more insights into how this interacts with the Java side of the world.
Yeah. I need to
super helpful.
I need to figure out how to engage the OpenJDK people too. I'll try to see if I can sort that out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's been a while since my brain has thought Java, so there's a little bit of residual thought in my brain, but it's not fresh.
Understood. All right. Multiverse is real. Get OpenJDK. Gotcha. All right. I'll see you guys next time.
Yep.
Whenever that is. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nell. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Take care. I had to figure out how to end the thing. Oh, there it is. All right, cool. All right, end.